Before dawn on the 29th of May, 1453, a flag goes up on a tower above a small wooden door in the wall of Manuel Comnenos. The door is barely the height of a man. It opens into a sallyport between the inner and outer line of the Theodosian walls, in the place where the land defenses seam together north of the Corinthian gate. The flag is white on red. The men who plant it are perhaps 50 Ottoman soldiers, exhausted, blackened with smoke. They do not break through the main wall. They walk through a door that was unlocked. Ducas, writing 30 years later in Lesbos, gives the door a name. He calls it the Kerkoporta, the circus gate. He says that the defenders, going out before dawn to sortie against the besiegers' line, neglected to bar it on their return. The Ottoman climbers found it. They went up onto the tower. They put the flag where the city could see it. The city was in its 1123rd year of standing. It was the second Rome. It had outlasted the first Rome by 1,000 years and 3 months. It would not last the next 40 minutes after that flag went up. This is the story of how a city of stone fell through a wooden door. It is the story of Constantine, the 11th Palaiologos, last Roman emperor, against Mehmed II of the Ottomans, 21 years old. The year 4773, Greeks held 14 miles of wall. It is also the story of an argument that has not been settled in 500 years. Was the door real? Or was it a tidy ending the chronicler reached for? Because the real ending had no single cause, and historians cannot bear that. I will tell you which side I lean toward, and why, but I will not pretend it is settled. Francis does not mention the Kerkoporta. He was in the inner court. Leonardo of Chios does not mention it. He was at the chain in the Golden Horn. Barbaro does not mention it. He was a surgeon below decks on a Venetian galley. Kritovolos, writing from inside Mehmed's court, does not mention it either. The Kerkoporta is in one chronicle, in one chapter, written by one man on an island in the Aegean, and the gate itself, physically, was found 900 years and 400 years later, in 1899, by an English antiquarian named Alexander van Millingen, who walked the walls of Manuel Comnenos with a measuring rod and a notebook, and identified the bricked-up arch and the masonry at the seam. If chronicles like this, single voices on the edges of catastrophes, contested by silence, are why you watch the channel, you already know what you are watching. There is more of this work waiting on this same channel. Back to the wall, before dawn. To understand what that door was, and how it came to be ajar at the hour the empire ended, you have to understand what the city had become by the spring of 1453, and what the man outside the walls had measured, very precisely, the winter before. Mehmed II was 21 years old. He had been sultan for 2 years on his second go. He had been sultan once before as a child, deposed by his own court, then restored after the death of his father, Murad II, in 1451. The court that deposed him remembered. He was not loved at his accession. He was tolerated. To survive, he needed a victory that was unanswerable. And there was only one such victory left in the world: the Roman city on the Bosphorus, the capital of the Caesars. Miklagard, as the Norse had called it, the city. The fact that everyone called it just the city tells you what taking it would mean. In the winter of 1452, before he had any army outside the gates, Mehmed did something that no Ottoman sultan had ever done. At least, that is the persistent tradition the Ottoman chronicles preserve. He went in person, with engineers, along the line of the Theodosian walls, and he measured. The Theodosian walls are not one wall. They are 3 lines in depth: an outer moat, then a low forewall called the protokysma, then a high main wall, studded with 96 towers, spaced about 70 meters apart. They had held the city against Avars in 626, Arabs twice, Bulgarians, Russians, Pechenegs, Crusaders the first time, and only failed in 1204 against Crusaders the second time. And that breach had been from the seaward side, not the land. The land walls had never been breached by a force coming from the west. Mehmed walked the seam. He found what every commander before him had found and could not exploit. The walls are not uniform. South of the Corinthian gate, the ridge dips down into the valley of the Lycus River. a stream, by then a sewer, that flows underground through the city into the Sea of Marmara. The walls follow the dip. In that dip, the high ground is outside the wall, not inside it. This is the Mesotichion, the middle wall, and it is the only place along 11 kilometers of land defense where the besieger looks down on the defender. Every general who had ever measured them had marked the Mesotichion as the place to strike. None had ever broken through. Mehmed had brought a second man with him on that walk, or rather, the second man had come to him a few months earlier and offered his services. His name was Urban. He was a Hungarian, some sources say Wallachian, who knew how to cast bronze cannon. He had first come to Constantinople and offered to build artillery for the Roman Emperor, Constantine XI. Constantine could not pay him. The treasury was empty. The Venetians were owed back wages, the Genoese were owed silver, the Patriarchate was selling icons. Urban went across the Bosphorus. Mehmed paid him 4 times what he had asked of Constantine, and gave him a foundry at Edirne, and asked one question. Can you cast a barrel that will throw a stone heavier than any wall can endure? Urban said yes. By the spring of 1453, he had cast more than 60 cannon of various sizes, and one monster, 27 feet long, throwing a stone ball of half a ton, requiring 60 oxen and 400 men to move it. This is the story we have been telling ourselves about why Constantinople fell. The cannon. The Ottoman bombards. Urban's monster. It is a clean story, a modern story. It has the shape of a science museum exhibit. The new technology meets the old, and the old crumbles. It is not how the wall fell. I want you to mark that, because I will come back to it. Urban's great gun could only fire 7 times a day. It cracked its own breech in the first week and had to be recast. The stones it threw were sometimes too large for the breach they made. They passed through the outer wall and gouged the inner wall, but did not topple it. The defenders, at night, repaired the breaches with earth and timber and stones from the city's monasteries, and by morning the wall was lower, but it was a wall again. For 53 days, the bombard pounded the Mesotichion. For 53 days, the defenders patched what the bombard broke. The bombard was terrifying, and it was loud, and it was the thing every chronicler put at the center of his account. But it was not what opened the city. Constantine XI Palaiologos took the throne in January 1449. He was one of the surviving sons of Manuel II, the brother of John VIII, and his accession was not in Constantinople. He was in Mistra, in the Morea, when his brother died, and he had himself crowned there, in a private ceremony, because the Patriarch in Constantinople was caught between the union of Florence with the Latins and the Orthodox party who refused it. Constantine ruled an empire that consisted of the city itself, the Morea, 3 islands, and a few coastal towns. By the standards of the Caesar Augustus, he was the prefect of a city. By the standards of the Theodosian house, he was the heir of Rome. He chose to be both, and to die as the latter. He was 49 the spring of the siege. He was tall, dark-eyed, a fluent Latin speaker, and, by the testimony of those who survived to write about him, fatalistic in a way the Italians at his court found difficult. He had been offered safe passage out of the city 3 times that spring, once by the Venetians, once by the Genoese of Galata across the Horn, once, at the very end, by Mehmed himself through an envoy. Sphrantzes records the last refusal. The emperor said in Greek that he had been entrusted with the city by God and would not leave it to others to die for him. That answer is a man's answer. The chroniclers liked it and copied it and embroidered it. Whether he said it on May 29th at 3 in the morning or whether Sphrantzes constructed the speech from his memory of what the emperor would have said, by Sphrantzes' count of what he heard with his own ears, the line is genuine, and Sphrantzes was the closest man to Constantine in the inner court. I lean towards Sphrantzes. What no chronicler tells you, including Sphrantzes, is the morning of March 28th, 1453, when Constantine ordered a census of every able-bodied man in the city, and Sphrantzes himself carried out the count. The Ottomans were not yet at the gates. Mehmed was 25 miles away, building the movable artillery train. The Venetian galleys had just arrived, late, with 200 ships marines. The emperor wanted to know how many men he had. Sphrantzes spent 5 days walking the parishes with 2 clerks. He counted the laymen of military age, the monks who would fight, the foreign sailors who had not yet sailed. He returned to the emperor in the private audience chamber. He gave the number. Constantine looked at the parchment, and he ordered Sphrantzes to keep the number secret. The number is one of the few that we have on faith from Sphrantzes himself, and that we have only because Sphrantzes wrote it down in his diary much later, after the city was gone. 4,773 Greeks. About 2,000 more were Latins, Venetians, Genoese, a few Catalans. Call the whole defense 7,000 on a good day. The walls being defended ran for 14 miles, on land and sea. That is a defender every 2.5 meters if you spread them along the entire perimeter, which of course you cannot, because then there is no reserve and no relief. In practice, it meant 1 man per 10 meters on the land walls, and almost nothing on the sea walls. And even that arithmetic required men to be on the wall continuously, without rotation, without sleep, for the full duration of whatever siege came. Constantine looked at the number. He ordered Sphrantzes to hide it. He did not want the people or the foreign captains or the patriarch to know how few they were. Sphrantzes obeyed. The number was published for the first time in the printed editions of his chronicle in the 17th century, 200 years after every man counted had been dead. By Sphrantzes' count, then, 4,773 Greeks held one of the longest sets of fortifications in the medieval world, against an army that the Ottoman chronicler Tursun Beg estimated at 80,000, and that modern scholars, Ducas at the high end, Critobulus at the low, put between 60 and 120,000 combatants, with another 100,000 camp followers, sappers, sailors, and laborers. The ratio is somewhere between 10 to 1 and 20 to 1. The defenders knew the number on the inside. They were never told the number on the outside. To understand how that thin line of men held for 53 days and then failed on the night the door was open, you have to understand what happened in the sea, on the land, and inside the Basilica of Hagia Sophia in the weeks before the wall ever broke. The chain went taut at sundown on the 2nd of April. It was the largest piece of metalwork in the eastern Mediterranean. Iron links, each link the size of a man's forearm, joined by oak rafts that floated the whole assembly on the surface of the Golden Horn. The chain ran from the seaward tower of Eugenios, on the Constantinopolitan side, to the Tower of Galata, on the Genoese side of the Horn. It had been there in some form since the 7th century. The Patriarchate had blessed it against the Avars in 626. Leo the Isaurian had reset it against the Arabs in 718. It had been raised, hauled, replaced, repaired, and now, in 1453, it sealed the only deep-water harbor the city had against a hostile fleet. Mehmed had a fleet. He had built it in the winter at Gallipoli. He had hired Greek and Italian shipwrights at 3 times the going rate. Tursun Beg gives the count at 145 sail. Critobulus says 400. The truth is probably somewhere between, but it does not matter what the exact number was, because none of those ships could get into the harbor, because of the chain. On the 3rd of April, the Ottoman vanguard arrived on the land side. By the 7th, Mehmed's camp stretched along the entire 14 kilometers of the Theodosian walls, an arc of tents and banners and oxen, with the great bombard at the center, opposite the Mesotichion, exactly where Mehmed had measured the dip in the winter. The first cannon shot was fired on the morning of the 12th. It threw a stone ball of 540 pounds, and it landed inside the city, in the second courtyard of the monastery of St. George of Mangana, and killed no one, because the monks had been warned and were inside the chapel praying. The Ottoman gun crews fired again 2 hours later, and 2 hours after that. The recharge took oxen, water, sponging, gunpowder. The bombard could not fire faster than 7 times in a day. The defenders learned the rhythm by sunset. They learned to scatter from the wall 10 seconds before the shot landed. The first day's gunnery killed perhaps a dozen people inside the city and damaged the outer wall by 1 panel. This again was the cannon that fell Constantinople. This was the new technology. This was the future arriving at the gates of the past. It was deafening. It was terrifying. It was theater. And it did not, in the first 10 days, in the first 20 days, in the first 30 days, achieve a breach that could be assaulted. What the cannon did was wear down the wall and wear down the men on it. The Mesotichion is a long horseshoe of stonework, and the bombard was aimed at one short segment of it. Call it 300 meters, the lowest part of the dip. By the third week of April, that segment had been hit between 200 and 300 times. The outer wall was rubble. The inner wall was still standing, but cracked, in places leaning, in places open. Every night, the Greek defenders and a contingent of Genoese, under a condottiere from Genoa named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, climbed down into the rubble with timbers and earth and stone from the city, and they rebuilt. Sometimes they rebuilt by torchlight, when the moon was down. Sometimes they used barrels packed with earth, dragged from the wine warehouses of the Messe. Giustiniani had arrived in January, on his own ship, with 700 mercenaries paid out of his own pocket, and the promise of the lordship of Lemnos, if the city held. He was 40 years old, from a Genoese trading family, with a reputation as a soldier and a recent term as consul of Kaffa on the Black Sea. The Genoese outposts the Crimean Tatars were then pressing. Constantine made him protostrator, commander of all land defenses, on the night he arrived. Francis records this without comment. The Greek aristocrats at the inner court were less generous about an Italian commanding the wall. Most of them had not been on a wall in 20 years. None of them volunteered to take it from him. Through April, the wall held. Through April, the chain held. Through April, Mehmed waited for the wall to fall under the cannon, and it did not. By the third week, the great bombard had cracked twice and been recast at Adern, 60 miles away, and remounted at the camp, a journey of 3 days each way with the 60 oxen. Mehmed needed another way in. What he did next is the moment I want you to mark, because it is the moment when most modern accounts of the siege actually feel something. The cannon belongs to a museum exhibit. The next thing belongs to the older register of war, where intelligence and obstinacy and pulleys and grease still matter more than gunpowder. On the night of the 21st of April, Mehmed pulled 70 of his ships from the Bosphorus, where they were useless against the chain, hauled them up onto the eastern bank of the Horn, fitted them onto cradles of greased timbers, and dragged them, by ox team and by hand, 2 miles overland, over a wooded ridge above the Genoese town of Galata, which had a treaty of neutrality, but pretended not to see, and lowered them into the Golden Horn behind the chain. Ducas describes the route in 2 short sentences. Kritovoulos, writing for Mehmed, gives the full schedule. The timbers cut from the Belgrade forest a month in advance. The grease rendered from sheep tallow and olive oil mixed. The cradles built so the keel rode high and the rowing decks did not crack on the gradient. Tursenbeg adds that the men hauling were given an extra ration of butter and bread that night. Whichever account you trust, you have the same picture. 70 galleys on greased rollers pulled overland in a single night by torchlight, over a hill that rises 150 feet from the Bosporus to the ridge and drops 120 feet to the Horn. They were in the water behind the chain by dawn. I have read this passage in Ducas and in Kritovoulos and in Francis 3 times each, and I notice what Francis does not say. He says nothing about the night the ships came over. He was inside the city, in the inner court, very close to the emperor. The lookouts on the sea walls of the Horn must have seen the torches. The sound of 70 keels on timber going over a wooded ridge 2 miles long is not a sound a sleeping city ignores. And yet Francis, who recorded the gold ornaments on the emperor's boots and the wording of his refusals to flee, says nothing about the morning the city woke up and saw an enemy fleet inside the chain. I think he did not write it down because there was nothing to be done about it. And a chronicler who could not name an act of defense was not going to name an act of defeat. That is my reading. Other historians, Donald Nicol among them, thinks Francis simply did not know, that the inner court was insulated from the harbor, and that the news came to him through diplomatic channels, not eyewitnesses. I lean toward the first reading. Francis knew. He stayed silent on it. The Italians did not stay silent. Barbaro, the Venetian surgeon, writes the morning in his diary with a single phrase, in Venetian dialect, Quaxe finita la fede. Here, the trust is finished. He meant the trust between the Genoese of Galata and the city, because the ships had to pass within musket shot of Galata's walls, and the Genoese, watching, had not even rung an alarm. The Genoese said later that they had not seen. Barbaro did not believe them. Most modern scholars do not believe them. For the next month, the Ottoman fleet inside the Horn was a knife at the city's other throat. The sea walls along the Horn were thin. They had never been built for major siege because the chain had always held, and now the city had to spread its already overstretched defense onto a wall it had counted on not defending. Constantine moved a contingent of the inner reserve to the Hornside wall. He took it from the Mesotichion. Mehmed, who had spies inside the city, knew within a day. By the first week of May, what had been the strongest sector of the land wall, the Mesotichion, defended by Giustiniani and 700 Genoese plus the best Greek troops, was now slightly thinner. Mehmed did not exploit it openly. He let it sit. He kept up the cannon. He let the defenders wear down rebuilding the wall every night. He was waiting, the way a chess player waits for the king to be forced into the corner before the mating sequence begins. On the 12th of May, an Ottoman sapper unit, working under cover of the bombardment, began the first mine. The mine was a tunnel from the Ottoman trench line in the dip, going under the outer wall, intended to come up inside the forewall and let assault troops bypass the rubble. The defenders heard it. Giustiniani had Greek miners from the Pontic silver mines, and they could read the vibration in a copper bowl of water set on the ground. They countermined. By the 15th of May, the two tunnels met somewhere under the Mesotichion, and they fought underground, with hand axes, by candlelight. The Greek miners won. 2 more mines were tried. 2 more were countered. By the 23rd of May, the last Ottoman mine was found before it crossed the wall foundation, and the defenders flooded it. The miners drowned. There were no more mines after that. I dwell on the mines because the textbook account of 1453 is the cannon, the cannon, the cannon, and the textbook account is wrong. The cannon hammered for 53 days and did not breach. The mines were countered. The fleet inside the Horn squeezed but did not strike. The siege was a stalemate. Mehmed was running out of time, and he knew it, because Hungarian envoys were already in the camp asking whether he might lift the siege in exchange for a tribute increase. And there were rumors, false but believed, of a Venetian relief fleet sighted off Chios. On the 25th of May, Mehmed called his war council. The Ottoman traditionalists, Chandarla Halil Pasha, the Grand Vizier, the conservative wing, argued for lifting the siege. Take the tribute, go home with honor, try again in 5 years. The Greek population could not be displaced. The walls could not be sustained. The city was eternal. Mehmed listened. Then he called the war faction, Zaganos Pasha, his teacher Akşem Seddin, the men who had backed his accession, and asked their view. They said, 1 assault, all at once. 3 days from now, if it fails, lift the siege. Mehmed agreed. The assault would come at midnight on the 28th of May into the morning of the 29th. He ordered 3 days of rest for the army. He ordered the cannon to fire continuously, day and night, those 3 days into the Mesotichion. He ordered torches lit along the entire Ottoman line at night, so the city could see the size of the camp. Inside the city, on the night of the 28th, something else was happening. The Greek population, which had divided for years over the Union of Florence, the agreement signed in 1439 that had reunified the Eastern and Western churches in exchange for Western military aid that had never come, set the division aside for a single night. The two factions, the Unionists and the Orthodox, processed together with the icon of the Theotokos Hodegetria, the painted board attributed by tradition to St. Luke, from the Hodegon Monastery up the Mess to Hagia Sophia. They sang together. They kissed the icon together. Constantine knelt before it. The Latin clergy were present in their vestments. Cardinal Isidore of Kiev, the papal legate, was at the emperor's side. This was not a moment of unity. It was a moment of fear, and the city wanted the icon on the wall before dawn. The icon had been on the wall in 626, and the Avars had withdrawn. It had been on the wall in 718, and the Arabs had withdrawn. It had been on the wall in 860, and the Rus had withdrawn. The icon had a record. The city wanted it where the wall was thinnest. Francis records that, during the night procession, the icon slipped from its bearers and fell into the mud of the Mise. The bearers struggled to lift it. The crowd took this as an omen. Francis adds, without elaboration, that the emperor turned to him afterward and said only that the people would need to be told this had not happened. He did not tell them. By morning, the icon was on the Mesotichion wall, where Justiniani's men could see it, where the bombards could hit it. The defenders kissed it as they passed it. Cardinal Isidore led the Latin office in the basilica. Constantine took communion in both kinds, the Greek and the Latin, and rode at midnight to the Mesotichion, to the place near the St. Romano's gate, where the breach was widest and where, by his own choice, he would be when the assault came. The bombards stopped firing at 11 in the evening. The silence, after 53 days of 2-hour rhythm, was, according to Barbaro, more terrifying than the noise had been. Men on the wall could hear, from across the dip, the rustle of leather and the clack of mailed feet forming in the dark. At 1:30 in the morning of the 29th of May, 1453, the first wave of the Ottoman assault began. There are 3 waves. Mehmed has planned them deliberately, in the Ottoman manner. The disposable troops first, the regulars second, the household guard last. The defenders on the wall do not know there will be 3 waves. They think the first wave is the assault. The first wave is the Bashi Bazouks, the irregular volunteers, the foreign mercenaries from Anatolia, Serbia, Greece, the Balkans, men who fight for plunder and bring their own arms. There are perhaps 15,000 of them. They run at the breach in the Mesotichion with ladders and grappling hooks. They are bunched, undisciplined, easy to shoot from the wall, and they are not meant to take the wall. They are meant to die on it, exhausting the defenders' arrows and stones. Barbaro, watching from the harbor, gives the rhythm. They came in waves like the sea and were broken on the rocks, and went back and came again. The Bashi Bazouks press for 2 hours. The Greek and Genoese troops on the Mesotichion fire crossbows down into the dip, drop stones, shoot the few hand cannons they have. Barbaro mentions them in passing, nothing more. The Bashi Bazouks fall in the dip. Some climb the rubble of the outer wall. None reach the inner wall. By 3 in the morning, Mehmed pulls them back, and the second wave forms. The second wave is Anatolian regulars, 5,000 in proper formation, with siege ladders cut to the height of the inner wall. They come up at the breach with discipline. They get higher than the first wave. Some of them reach the top of the rubble and grapple the inner wall. One of them, a soldier from Ulubat in Anatolia, named Hassan, whom Tursunbeg singles out, climbs onto the inner wall itself and plants an Ottoman standard there. He is cut down within the minute. Other Anatolians try to follow him and fail. The standard is taken down, the wall is held. By 4:30, the second wave breaks and goes back. The eastern sky is beginning to gray. Mehmed sends in the Janissaries. The Janissaries are the household. They are Mehmed's personal guard, trained from childhood as Christian-born slaves of the Ottoman state, the closest equivalent the medieval Mediterranean produced to a standing professional army. There are between 3,000 and 5,000 of them at the wall that morning. The sources disagree, as the sources always do on numbers. Tursunbeg says 3,000. Dukas says 5. The Janissaries do not run, they walk. They walk in formation, with sabers and short bows, in a long, disciplined line over the bodies of the Bashi Bazouks and Anatolians, and they reach the rubble of the outer wall fresh. The Greek defenders on the inner wall have been fighting for 3 hours. Their arrows are running low. Justiniani is at the center, at the breach, with his 700 Genoese in a tight knot, fighting the Janissaries hand to hand on the broken stones. It is here that the chronicles converge. Francis, Ducas, Leonardo, Barbaro, Critouvulos, all of them name the same event, and they do not always name the same events. Giovanni Giustiniani Longo is wounded. The chroniclers do not agree on how. Leonardo says an arrow, in the chest, in the gap between the upper plates of his cuirass. Ducas says a culverin ball, a small lead shot from a hand cannon, in the leg. Sfrances says simply that he was wounded gravely. Kritavoulos, the Ottoman partisan, claims the wound was light and that Giustiniani used it as an excuse to leave the wall. Barbaro, who was on a ship in the Horn and did not see it, repeats what the Greeks told him afterward, that Giustiniani was struck in the right arm by an arrow that went through the silver gilt plate of his cuirass at the seam where the pauldron met the body. I believe Leonardo, who was inside the city, near the wall, and who wrote his account to Pope Nicholas V within 2 months of the event. The arrow at the seam of the cuirass is consistent with Leonardo's description, and with what we know of the type of armor Giustiniani wore. The point is not the precise wound. The point is what Giustiniani did next. He turned. He asked Constantine for the key to the inner wall, the wall behind the inner Theodosian line, so that he could be carried back to the harbor for treatment. Constantine, by Sfrances' account, begged him to stay, to be bandaged on the wall in view of his men, and Giustiniani refused. The key was given. The small inner gate was unlocked. Giustiniani was carried through it. His Genoese saw him go. They did not understand whether he was returning or leaving. They began to leave with him. What happened in the next 10 minutes is, to my reading, the moment the city fell. The Genoese were the spine of the Mesotichion defense. When their commander went down and went back, they followed. The Greek troops at the center saw the Genoese leaving the breach. They did not know if it was a retreat or a rotation. They held for a few minutes more, and then they too began to fall back. The line at the breach went slack. A Janissary unit, perhaps 200 men, found themselves on the rubble of the outer wall, with no concentrated Greek opposition for the first time that night. They pushed up. They reached the inner wall. They began to climb. And it is at this moment, by Ducas's chronology, that the news ran through the line that the flag was already on the tower. A different flag behind them, to the north, in the seam where the wall of Manuel Comnenos joined the Theodosian system. The Ottoman flag was up. The flag was on a tower that no one had attacked. There had been no assault on that section. There was no breach there. Ducas writes, they found one of the gates, called by the Romans the Kerkoporta, accidentally left open. They went up and showed the flag from the tower. His phrasing in the original Greek is matter of fact. The verb he reaches for is the verb a Byzantine bureaucrat would use for an unbarred door, not a treason, not a betrayal. The Kerkoporta was forgotten. Sfrances, again, does not mention it. Leonardo does not mention it. Barbaro does not. Kritavoulos does not. The Ottomans' own accounts give the credit for the breakthrough to the cannon at the Mesotichion. The Genoese tell the story of Giustiniani's wound. The Greeks talk about the icon falling in the procession the night before. Only Ducas, writing in Lesbos, in the late 1460s, names the door. This is where the historians divide. Marios Philippides and Walter Hannock, in their long volume of 2011, argue that the Kerkoporta is exactly what Ducas says it is. The gate has been found. Alexander van Millingen, in 1899, identified the bricked-up arch in the wall of Manuel Comnenos at the precise location Ducas describes. And Ducas, as the friend of the family of John VIII Palaiologos, and a meticulous chronicler in other matters, is to be trusted. The silence of the other sources is positional. Sfrances was in the inner court, Leonardo at the harbor, Barbaro on a ship, Kritavoulos in Mehmed's camp. None of them were on the north section of the land wall. Stephen Reinert, in a late 1990s essay on the Ottoman and modern historiography of the conquest, argues the opposite. Ducas, writing 30 years later, needed a single physical cause for the fall. A door left open is a literary device older than the Iliad. The same trope appears in Greek accounts of the fall of Sardis to Cyrus, of Athens to Sulla. In the Plutarchan tradition, Ducas had read carefully. The Kerkoporta was almost certainly walled up well before 1453, Reinert argues, and Ducas placed it in his narrative because the fall otherwise had no clean explanation. I lean toward Philippides, and I will tell you why. The gate exists. Van Millingen physically identified the arch. The wall of Manuel Comnenos, where Ducas places it, is a 12th century addition to the Theodosian system, exactly the kind of seam where a sally port would be set, and where a sally port could be forgotten on a night of confusion. And Ducas, although he wrote in Lesbos, was a man with contacts in the city. Greek refugees, Genoese sailors, Ottoman officials he interviewed. He had no reason to invent a door at a precise location and give it a name that was unusual in Byzantine usage. He gave it the name Kerkoporta, from Kirkos, the circus, because the gate opened, originally, onto an old hippodrome of Constantine's. That is the kind of detail an inventor of literary devices does not include. The argument cannot be settled. Reinhardt is right that Ducas's narrative is cleaner than the truth probably was. Philippides is right that the gate is physically present, and that the silence of other chroniclers does not equal the silence of the city. My best reading, having read all 4 chronicles in translation and the modern arguments multiple times, is that the Kerkoporta was real, was opened in a sortie before dawn, was not barred on the return, and that the small Ottoman climbing party that found it climbed because that was their job. Climbers in the Ottoman army were paid to look for unguarded points along an entire siege line. They found one. They climbed. Whether or not the door was the single cause, the flag went up on the tower at 5 in the morning. The flag was visible from the Mesotichion, behind the Greek line. The Greek defenders, already shaken by Justiniani's departure, saw the flag and broke. The cry, "The city is taken," ran along the wall from north to south. It was not yet true. The wall was still being defended in pockets, at the Carizian gate and at the gate of St. Romanos. But once the cry begins, a wall is no longer a wall. Constantine XI Palaiologos was, by the testimony of Sphrantzes, who was near him, mounted in the inner court behind the St. Romanos gate when the cry came down the line. A later chronicler in the Sphrantzes tradition gives the emperor's last words, with the standard reservation that this passage is in the longer text usually called Pseudo-Sphrantzes, a 16th century expansion of the surviving Sphrantzes diary, not in the diary itself. "Is there no Christian here to take my head?" He took off the gold and purple imperial cloak. He took off the helmet ornaments that identified him. He kept only, and this is in Sphrantzes, the ornaments on his boots, 2 double-headed eagles in gold, sewn into the leather, the marks of a Palaiologos that he had worn since his coronation in Mistra. He rode forward into the press, with his cousin Theophilos Palaiologos at his side and a small troop of Greek knights. He was last seen, in Sphrantzes' words, going down toward the breach as one going to his own death. His body was not, in the first hours, identified. The city was sacked for 3 days, by the custom of war. Mehmed himself entered through the Edirne Gate on the afternoon of the 29th, on horseback, in the dust of the army, and rode through the empty Messe to Hagia Sophia. He dismounted before the bronze doors. The Ottoman tradition records a gesture of humility before the size of the conquest, a handful of dust onto the turban, though the chronicles disagree on the precise form. He entered, he prayed, he ordered the basilica converted to a mosque within the week, as the custom of war also dictated. On the 2nd day of the sack, a body was brought to him from the press near the St. Romanos gate. The body was naked. It had been stripped of armor and clothing by looters. It had no face the soldiers could recognize, but on the feet were the 2 gold double-headed eagles, sewn into the boots, the mark of a Palaiologos. Ducas records this. The Ottoman tradition, preserved a century later in Turkish chronicles, says the same. Mehmed had the head severed and displayed, the chronicles say, on a column in the public space outside Hagia Sophia. He had the body, according to Critavoulis, buried in an unmarked place, though no one has ever been able to identify the location, and the rumor that